Good morning. My name is Craig, and I am one of the pastors here at Paradox, and if we have not met, it is very nice to see you this morning. Today we are looking at 1 Timothy chapter 3, which is a very interesting passage of Scripture. And we're going to do something a little bit different today. Rather than asking you questions at the end of this sermon like we normally do in a reflection time, we actually want to invite you to text in your reflections and share with us what you've experienced in the discussion that has started in this sermon. And I say that specifically because here at Paradox, sermons are designed to start discussions and not end them. If this is your first time here, we live and die by this mantra, the idea that I'm not up here trying to tell you the authoritative word on this passage. I just think it starts an interesting discussion, and I hope that this sermon inspires discussions in your personal life after the service that make you think critically about what you believe. Also, I have to tell you that today's sermon is going on a wild journey through the wilderness, and you may be tempted to think at some point, I'm not sure he's ever going to actually talk to me about my life. I have to tell you, just calm down, it's okay. Today's sermon has a personal and practical application at the very end. So if you're like, what's in this for me? You will know by the end of this sermon. Does that sound good? Okay, 4 people are excited. We're going to get the rest of you by the end of this sermon. So let's turn to 1 Timothy. While we are turning there, we have to do a bit of a recap because this is part 3 of our 5-part series in 1 Timothy. Now, if you were with us a couple of weeks ago, we discussed the thesis statement of 1 Timothy, which is found in chapter 6, verse 20, when the author of 1 Timothy writes these words to Timothy. He says, "Guard what has been entrusted to you," which is a fancy way to say to Timothy, hey, we are called to maintain the status quo. And that sound that you just heard is all of our souls dying. Because this might be the most uninspiring thesis statement of any of the books of the Bible. Think about this. We're called to maintain the status quo. We're called to keep church open. We're called to keep church going. As long as it just stays the same, that's what God wants from us. That's what the author of 1 Timothy is arguing for. Now, if you hear that and you say, that's a bit uninspiring, where did we get this letter from? We have to go back to the source of the material. This letter is attributed to Paul the Apostle. And Paul was thought very highly of back in his day, and when he died, several generations passed before his letters were collected and then assembled into the New Testament. And the only reason 1 Timothy is in the Bible is because church councils, hundreds of years after the life of Paul, believed that Paul wrote 1 Timothy. However, modern advancements in science, technology, literature, and academia have proven that Paul didn't actually write 1 Timothy. Instead, the hypothesis is that sometime after Paul's death, a group of men who were in powerful church positions looked around and they said, we love our power. How can we have more of it? Hard to believe, I know. They said these words, and they said, why don't we write a letter to today's church from Paul and tell everyone it was written by Paul, even though we wrote it. So they wrote this letter, and the whole letter is about how you should trust church leadership, and church leadership really knows what's best for everyone else, and we should guard what's been entrusted to us, so always trust the authorities. And that's how we ended up with 1 Timothy, and its completely uninspiring thesis statement. Now, here's what's really interesting about 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy's got a lot of misogyny in it. A lot of anger, a lot of hatred, a lot of suspicion. It's not a book that helps us follow God. So therefore, our responsibility reading it today is to respond to 1 Timothy by saying no. And if we can learn to say no to 1 Timothy, then we can discover the yes that we need to embrace in order to follow God. So we're going to read through a passage, and it may sit a little funny with you, and we're supposed to respond by saying no, and then ask ourselves, what reality is this opening up if we are saying no to this? So that's the intro. We're going to go to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and dive right into it. We read these words. The saying is sure, whoever aspires to the office of bishop desires a noble task. Now, some English translations have the word bishop here. It's from the Greek word Episcopals. Let me hear you say Episcopals this morning. Yes, now you know where the Episcopalians get their name from. The Episcopos is a church leader, and in some English translations, it's translated as the word overseer. However, we have to remember that this is a church leader, so it's okay to insert the word that you would use for a church leader in your day and age. For many of you, that will be the word pastor. So, the saying is sure, whoever aspires to the office of pastor desires a noble task. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2 and 3. Now a pastor must be above reproach, married only once, temperate, sensible, we're going here, respectable, hospitable, an apt teacher, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. And as I stand before all of you this morning with these words behind me, I know that all of you are running me through this filter right now. I feel very judged in this moment. The author continues, he must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil, not like those lifelong religious folks that we all know and love, right? We continue. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace and the snare of the devil. These are the requirements for the Episcopals, the leaders, the bishops, the overseers, or the pastors. And if you're like me, you read all this and you say, there's something wrong with 1 Timothy 3. But it's not just one thing. There are 3 things wrong with 1 Timothy. So let's look at all of these things that are wrong with 1 Timothy 3, shall we? The idea is that we're studying 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. But what's important for every person who considers themselves to be a student of the Bible is to remember that all of those chapters and verses were arbitrary inventions that were later added. When you look at the Bible, you'll see these numbers that pop up next to verses and headings that say chapter 1 or chapter 2 or chapter 3. When 1 Timothy was originally written, there were no chapter numbers or verse numbers. It was just the letter of 1 Timothy. In fact, chapters weren't added to the Bible until the 13th century. That means 1 Timothy existed for over 1,000 years without having any chapter divisions. Now, chapters were very popular because instead of people saying, I really like that part in 1 Timothy that's about a third of the way through but not quite halfway through, that's a really inspiring part. They could all of a sudden say, I really like 1 Timothy 2, which proved that person was a misogynist because that's where they say that women should be silent in churches. Now, the chapters were so popular, it made it so much easier to converse about the Bible that 300 years later, the churches decided to add verse numbers sometime around the 16th century. This is important for us to remember because there are 6 chapters in 1 Timothy. And if we forget this, then we have this idea that, well, here's what the author of 1 Timothy did. He sat down to write a letter, and he had a thesis statement, and he had 6 supporting arguments, which is why there are 6 chapters. But those chapter numbers were added much later, 1,000 years later, and sometimes they really put the chapter numbers in the wrong place, including 1 Timothy chapter 3. There are 6 chapters in 1 Timothy, but they were added much later. So let's go to 1 Timothy 3 and see what happens when we separate 1 Timothy 3 from 1 Timothy 2. We read, he must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? What words jump off the page at you when you read this? Submissive is a good one because that's definitely part of the theme, but the common theme that you're going to get to with that is the masculine pronouns he and his. Just 8 verses earlier, in the previous paragraph, the author, without having any chapter separation, writes these words that we talked about last week. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. And 1 Timothy 3 that talks about all the things a pastor should do and be is very much talking about only what male pastors should do and be, and it's very much a continuation of this thought that begins 1 paragraph earlier. If we don't acknowledge the chapter divisions as arbitrary before that, we completely miss the misogyny that happens in 1 Timothy 3 that began in 1 Timothy 2. So the first thing that's wrong with 1 Timothy 3 is this passage exists to oppress women. So if we were to say, oh, I like part of 1 Timothy 3, you have to say, wait. I'm not sure we should like any part of 1 Timothy 3 because this is deeply problematic and against the will of God. Which brings us to the second thing that's wrong with 1 Timothy 3. Here we have all these requirements for what a pastor or a bishop or an overseer should be. Pastor must be above reproach, married only once, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, an apt teacher, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. I have to tell you that I have spent over a decade in the pastoral field. And when you spend your decade in the pastoral field, you work primarily with men because this is a male-dominated field because sexism is real, right? I have found that the way that men react to this passage is they read these things and they say, oh, because I'm a pastor, I'm all of these things. Rather than looking at this list and saying, oh, I'm a pastor, I should strive to become these things. We have a word for that. The word is entitled. And the second thing that's wrong with 1 Timothy 3 is male pastors feel entitled to this list simply because they are a pastor. If you ever hear a male pastor stand up and quote 1 Timothy 3, it is almost always an abuse of power. And when we look at how this plays out, people start to say, well, you have to trust me because I'm these things. It says this right here in scriptures. This is a problem with 1 Timothy 3. Which brings us to the third thing that's wrong with this chapter. When we go to this verse, verses 4 and 5, we read, he must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. Every parent at this point says, I could never be a pastor. And when you think about what this means, all of a sudden you can feel this shift in the room go from a focus on what I'm doing to a focus on what my kids are doing. And people are looking at Maya and Bodhi and thinking, are they behaving? Are they staying in order? Are they staying quiet? Are they sitting? Are they attentive? And when you think about how special Maya and Bodhi are and how much they mean to me, it is a horrible thing to think that their behavior is somehow some indication of my job performance, right? Imagine whatever it is that you do, your kid having a bearing on how your supervisor perceives you doing your job. Because let's face it, Maya and Bodhi are not just pastors' kids. They're kids. And they do things that kids do. And guess what? They should be free to do those things. Amen. Because we're just a family like all the families here. And when you consider that there's that other restriction that says pastors can only be married once, that puts a lot of pressure on Kimmy and my marriage, which it's a great marriage. I love her to death. But why do we need this extra pressure to indicate whether or not I can be a capable pastor? The third thing that's wrong with 1 Timothy 3 is this passage is just unfair to pastors' families. And when you consider these three things, even though some of this may sound good to you and there may be some job description in here, it's important for us to recognize the larger picture and to say to this passage of Scripture, no, we're not going to do that. Because this whole passage exists to oppress women, because men have for too long stood up and felt entitled to what this list says, and this passage has placed unfair pressure on pastors' family. We're not going to do this. But if we are saying no to 1 Timothy 3, then the question we've been asking all series long is, what exactly is it that we're saying yes to? And to answer that question, I want to tell you a bit of a story. 5 years ago, we started Paradox Church. And I don't know if you know this, but if you start a church, everyone wants to tell you what they think about that church, whether you want them to tell you or not. Do not start a church if you don't like people walking up to you and saying, let me tell you what I think about what you're doing. Not the right move there, right? Now, you have all had some various relationship with this church, whether it's your first time here or you've been going to this church for 5 years. But some rumblings that we consistently hear from people outside of our church is that once they know a little bit about us from casual observance online or anything else, is they start to say something along the lines of this. They say, Craig just went and started his own church so that he could say whatever he wanted to say without any oversight or accountability. Has anybody else heard something like this? A few people, yeah, we got it. So I want you to know I've heard this several times, and I have to laugh. And the reason I have to laugh is because we all of a sudden have to launch into an important conversation. And this important conversation, I want to begin with a question. Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone on the spectrum, may I ask you this? Are you ready to talk about church structure? Yeah. Now, if you're like, wait a second, is there still the personal application at the end of this? Yes, do not worry, I have not forgotten about you. We'll get there, okay? So, we have to talk about church structure because this is a very important conversation, particularly in light of 1 Timothy 3. All the way back on January 30, 2016, there was a group of less than 15 people that got together in a living room and said, we should start a church together. Now, this grew out of a young adult group. We had some history together, but we sat around and we had this sense of like, we should start a church. Let's figure out how to do it. And the way you start a church is you have to have a meeting with minutes where somebody makes a motion and says, I vote we start a church. Someone seconds it, and there's a vote, and it's recorded in the minutes. This happened on January 30, 2016, and shortly after that vote was taken, they looked at me and they said, now you have to go outside. So I went outside. It was January. It was cold. I remember sitting in my cold car waiting for them to discuss who they were going to hire as their pastor. So I'm in the car, I'm waiting. After about 5 minutes, I'm like, why is this taking so long? I come back in, and rather than tell me anything, they just roll up a piece of paper, and they stick it under my collar like I'm some sort of priest. I still don't get this. It's been over 5 years. Like, I've never worn a priest like a collar in my lifetime, but this was the move here. So anyways, we started talking about what the churches, they said, congratulations, we want you to be our pastor. We then voted to include people on a founding board that would set up what the church would be, and this founding board met every week on Wednesday night. We would meet for an hour and a half, and this founding board was Brandon Herman, Maddie Kattenhorn, Eric Peterson, Ken Schofield, Tammy Schwelt, and Emily Underseer. Now, it's a bit intimidating to try and figure out how you set up a church and how it works in a way that is ethical and kind and compassionate and doesn't fall into all the pitfalls that we've seen other churches fall into. And while church structure was difficult, one thing that we knew how to do was put a worship service together. So before we figured out all of the pieces, on February 20, 2016, we had our first worship gathering in the Mission Gables Bowl House just down the road from here, and it was a sloppy, happy, fun mess that had no idea which way it was going. There was no structure put in place. We said to people, we're gonna have a structure eventually, we'll figure it out. But after this, we had a lunch, people asked questions, and then everyone left, and we said, okay, we can do this, but how do we actually function? Now, it's here that when people say, do you ever have a sense that God was involved in Paradox Church starting, that the most tangible moment in all of our church history that happened that gave me a sense that this is where God wanted us to go? I got a call, completely random, from a guy I'd never met. His name was Ron Gladden. I still have not met this man to this day. He called me and he said, hey, my name's Ron. I heard you're starting a church. I said, okay, thanks. He's like, look, I started a church too. I grew up in a denomination. I started a church too. I broke away, started planting churches. I just want you to know we could talk for hours. We could talk about all sorts of things. It won't help as much as what I'm about to do for you. And I said, what's that? I thought he was about to sell me something. He said to me, I'm going to give you our church bylaws, and this is the best church structure I've found. And I have to tell you, like, you can take this, you can just change the title and the church's name and keep everything else the same. I'm not looking for money. I just want you to know this is the most helpful thing I can give to you is this document. And he said, I would encourage you to go through it with your team and see if this is right for you, and you can modify as much as you want or as little as you want. It's all yours. So I talked to Ron a couple more times after that, but I started looking through this structure and talking about it with the founding board, and I have to tell you, this church structure is brilliant. And it begins first and foremost with the members. Now, members at Paradox are an interesting conversation to have because we don't really like to push membership, and yet at the same time, the number one question I get asked about Paradox is, how many members do you have? The answer is 68. If anybody wants to know. Now, we don't push that because members have one primary responsibility, which we'll talk about in a moment. But when we were talking with the founding board all those years ago, we talked about what we wanted membership to be, namely, not exclusive. And so we came up with 2 requirements for people to be members at Paradox. All people have to do to become a member is support or say yes to these 2 things. The first one is they have to support Paradox's mission. Does anyone here know what Paradox's mission is? To see and embrace Jesus Christ in all. As I said earlier, we believe Jesus Christ can be found in all, both the heartache and the hope, both the happiness and the sadness, in all that we experience. Whether you go to a Jay-Z concert or a Hillsong concert, God is present everywhere, right? And there's nowhere you can go where God is not there. And so our church exists to help you to see God in all that you experience, and also to recognize that every human being on the planet is made in the image of Christ. And that can be difficult sometimes, but that's why we're here. So if you support that mission and you say that's a worthwhile mission, you're halfway to membership if you so desire. The second one is you have to find Paradox to be a spiritual home. And whatever it is that you identify as, whatever religion you say you ascribe to, you are welcome here. If you come here and sit among us and you say, there's something about sitting here that feels like home. And we leave that completely up to you to decide if you feel like this is your spiritual home. Now, one important distinction to make here is that we purposely moved membership away from baptism. Because when you are baptized into the body of Christ, which is much bigger than Paradox. And that decision requires some form of belief. This one, membership, does not. We don't require you to believe anything that you don't want to believe. We did this on purpose because we have several couples here where one person's an atheist, one person's a Christian, and we want them to be able to participate fully without asking them to believe anything different. So this is all it takes to be a member, is to support Paradox missions and to find Paradox to be a spiritual home, which leads to the members' one responsibility, which is to nominate and vote for elders. Elders are elected representatives from the church that are nominated and voted on by the members, and they have their primary responsibility, which is to oversee the spiritual health and spiritual growth of Paradox. All of the difficult ethical decisions that Mandy and I face while being on staff, we bring to the elders, and we try to work through processes and ideas with all of them. Now, currently, we have 14 elders here at Paradox Church. I'm going to say all their names because they are just wonderful, beautiful people. Christian Barrera-Sandry, Sally Burton, Thomas Jacques, Jen Kim, David Lee, Maria Letts, Jonathan Montplaisir, Alvin Poblacion, Darius Sanker, Marilee Schofield, Hillary Suho, who is our head elder, and also the youngest elder, might I add, Abby Thomas, Emily Unterseer, and Mike Young. Now, yeah, you can get excited for those people. These elders, as chosen by the 86 members of the church, represent the church body, and they help Mandy and I do the best we can to meet Paradox's mission. Now, this group has been really helpful to us. We meet with them once a month, and you have probably interacted with their work on some level, because most people find us today by Googling affirming churches in Redlands. And if you Google that, Paradox's website shows up, you'll find this, and these are the 4 statements from the elder about LGBTQIA affirmation, women's empowerment, anti-racism, and the statement of belief. All of these have been massive discussions and carefully thought about by elders. There's been commissioned subcommittees to make sure that we're hitting the right marks with these statements. But if you have enjoyed any of these statements, the only reason they have any weight is not because I said it, but because elected representatives from the church stood up and said, this is what this church is about. And so when we say, oh, we're an affirming church, it's not, oh, Pastor Craig and Pastor Mandy are affirming. It's, no, the church is affirming. When we say we strive to empower women, it's not what the pastors are saying, it's what the church is saying. And when we say anti-racism is sacred work, it's what the church is saying. And it all comes from that elder board that oversees the spiritual health and growth of Paradox. Now, we have a second board that exists at Paradox, and that board is the trustees. And the trustees are nominated by me, the lead pastor, and then approved by the elders. And the trustees are responsible to oversee the financial health and responsibility of Paradox. Now, I'm going to get to the trustees in a second, but this is what's really brilliant about this church structure, in my opinion. It separates all the financial decisions away from the ethical ones. So when we're making decisions about what we need to do, we're not saying, how will this affect our bottom line, or will it make this donor angry? It's saying, what is the right thing to do, and where is God calling us? And we make those decisions independent of finances. Now, the Board of Trustees, though, is very important, and I love working with them as well. There are 9 people on the Board of Trustees. There's Pablo Ariza, Brandon Herman, Tammy Mathis, Eric Peterson, Kelly Phipps, Russell Schwelt, Ken Schofield, Hillary Suho, who serves because she's our head elder, and Mike Unterseer. Now, this group, every dollar that you give in support of this church goes to this group. They oversee the budget and how to best set it in a way that is responsible stewardship. And they look at spreadsheets a lot, and they really like it. That's who this group is. And this group also oversaw our biggest financial decision, which was to purchase a building, a warehouse on Lawton Street. And we are currently developing this into a spiritual worship center that we are hoping to be in by the end of next year. All of that came from the trustees' direction, wisdom, and insight, and I am grateful to be able to serve with that group. Now, there's one other board that many of you probably don't know about, and that board is called the Board of Overseers. Now, overseers are nominated by me, the lead pastor, and approved by the Board of Elders, same thing as trustees, but the overseers only get involved when Paradox is in a crisis, because their responsibility is to oversee investigations, disciplines, and/or termination of the lead pastor. And so when we were trying to figure out who the overseers would be, we wanted people who were off campus that loved both me and loved the church, and we came up with 4 names, and they all graciously agreed to serve as overseers about 5 years ago. Those 4 are Tanya Acuna, Dustin Aho, Maury Jackson, and Randy Spire. Now, we chose these people very carefully because at some point in my life, all 4 of the overseers have told me that I am wrong. And when they told me I was wrong, I was able to hear it, and I changed my life based on what they told me, and I knew that they cared about me enough to help me become better. So these overseers can end my job, and I trust them to make the best decision for this church and for me if ever that situation arises, because they are called on when someone goes to the complaint to the elders and says, Craig has been wrong in this. The elders can either speak to me about it, or they can talk to the overseers, and if it's a crisis, the overseers will get involved and lead an investigation. And so that is how this whole structure works, and everyone can participate if they want to as a member, and then there's elders that are elected, trustees are appointed, and overseers who oversee the whole thing. Now, there's one other group I want to tell you about that I think is important. It's an unofficial group. It's not in our bylaws, but they are very important to this church's well-being as well. A few years ago, back when Paradox just started, I preached a sermon in Ezekiel, and someone got really mad at me. And he came up and he was just furious. He felt like I had just overreached my boundaries. He felt like that I had said too much about what I felt and not enough about what the text felt. And this person said something along the lines of, why do we just sit around and listen to one person's opinion on the Bible? I think it's a good question to ask, right? And even though he was mad at me, I stopped him right there and I said, that's a great question. That should change. And from that moment forward, we started a sermon study group, which is a group of people who meet with me once a week. And we sit down, they hear draft 1 of every one of my sermons, including this one. And we sit around a table and I present an idea. And there's many times they point out my blindness, my ignorance, and all sorts of things that I've got wrong. And they help me try to see it from multiple perspectives. So that way, sermons that you hear are not just my opinion, but are representative of a larger group. The 7 people who serve on that unofficial board are Colin George Babb, Jen Kim, Olivia Moses, David Lee, Jeff Partain, Kelly Phipps, and Kahari Washington. And so we have these 5 different bodies that oversee these different things that are being said and how employment works and responsibility of money and the spiritual health and well-being. And a question arises, why do we do all this? Why is it that we go to all these lengths and worry about bylaws and spend time going over different lines and spend even a sermon talking about this? It's because when somebody says, Craig just went out and started his own thing so he could say whatever he wants without accountability, I look at this community and I start to laugh because I've worked in other churches outside of this community, and I have to tell you, I've never had more accountability in my career than at Paradox Church. I've never had more people say, hey, what are you doing? Where's it going? Are you being responsible? Are you acting right? Are you doing stuff that is acting in integrity? And while most of us like to shy away from accountability and oversight, I have to tell you something. I love it. I love everything about it. You know why? I have the sense that the people at this church and the people who are in leadership and the people who oversee what I do absolutely love the church and they love me. And that may sound like a rubber stamp committee, and I have to tell you, there have been many times I have been told no while I'm at Paradox. And that's okay because people are invested in this community and its well-being. Now, another piece that is often misunderstood is I have the opportunity, the privilege, and the responsibility of being able to speak on a nearly weekly basis in front of you. Now and then, I get very gracious comments from you where people say very kind things about how they appreciate what I say, how I come at things with different angles, how I'm willing to talk about things that are hard to talk about. And I have to tell you, I really appreciate those kind words, but I get way too much credit for what happens because Paradox is much bigger than me. Paradox involves all sorts of people who believe that we should talk about things that are hard to talk about. Paradox is a community of people who believe that sermons should start discussions and not end them. Paradox has all sorts of beautiful services that I have nothing to do with, like Pride Sabbath, Feminine Divine. Just last week, hearing Deidre read that beautiful answer from Priscilla, there are these moments where it all of a sudden becomes apparent that this is much bigger than one person, and no one person deserves the credit. And so something that's important for all of us to remember is that Paradox is a community, not a personality. It's much bigger than me. And I have the opportunity to speak up and speak in a way that hopefully reflects how trustees and elders and greeters and hospitality team and tech team feels. I get all of this responsibility and excitement, but this is a voice for and part of the community, not a voice who speaks to the community. With me? This is a moment where it's like we get to be in a community and have this support from these elders who believe that it's very important that we talk about these difficult things. Which brings us to the third thing we got to point out when we ask, why do all of this church structure? I, as your pastor, have heard your stories. And I've heard some great stories and some stories of celebration, but I've also heard some stories that are disheartening and discouraging. Most of us here have experienced the pain of weaponized religion, right? At some point, several people here have experienced toxic religion, and they've either seen it as a bystander or they've been the brunt end of it. And it's painful, right? And when I look back at Paradox Church's short history, and I look back at the 5 years we spent together, I can tell you stories about how we formed the bylaws, how we got things together, how elders came on, how elders rotated off, how trustees joined, what decision led to what outcome. I've seen all of it, right? And there's never once been a moment where someone said, do we really need all this oversight? I mean, our pastors seem like good people. Surely they'll be the right person for this and they'll do the right thing. There's something about this church that we do not believe that we are immune to the sin of toxic Christianity. I believe that if I have no oversight, no accountability, I will make a mess of things. And so that's why I am so grateful to trustees, to elders, to members who vote, who participate in holding the church and the pastors accountable, because it ultimately reminds us that we have to avoid toxic Christianity at all costs. There's too many stories of tears about toxic Christianity, and we are doing our best as an imperfect church to avoid that. And I believe the best way we avoid that is by acknowledging that we are not immune to it. If we are saying no to 1 Timothy 3, which is trying to tell us what pastors should be, what are we saying yes to? I believe that we are saying yes to a communal accountability that is rooted in love, in relationships, and growing integrity. That's what we are working toward as a church. And when I read 1 Timothy 3, it's not a perfect church, but we have to create a church that is rooted in these things and holds people, specifically pastors, accountable in a loving and compassionate way. Which brings us to the personal application that I know you all have been waiting for. The first thing that I would encourage you to think about in your own life is that all of us need someone who can tell us no. All of us need someone who can tell us no. Because you can only see things from your own perspective. And if you have someone who loves you and loves who you are trying to become and the work that you are doing, then that person is worth listening to when they say, no, you shouldn't do that. Now, if somebody tries to barge into your life and says, I want to be the person that holds you accountable, do not let that person hold you accountable. It's always a toxic recipe right there, right? But if someone genuinely loves you and loves the work you are doing, whatever work it is that you do, then can you allow them to say no and trust them when they say that? The second thing I want to say to you that I've learned from this story is that it is important for all of us to live deeply in community. I love the Church of Paradox because guess what? There are valuable relationships that are here, and I have seen you build relationships with each other as well. And if this is your first time at Paradox, welcome. We're glad that you're here. I'm not trying to say you have to live deeply in this community. You might have a community that goes off-roading every weekend. That's great. I encourage you to do that. But there is something about life that is meant to be experienced in deep relationships with others. And anytime you think, oh, this might be better by myself, it's always better to return to community and live deeply in there, whatever that community may be. And the third thing is to remind ourselves that none of us, no matter how long we've been going to church, are immune to the sin of toxic Christianity. We need to strive to be people not who are the best Christians, but instead are people who are committed to growing integrity. And growing integrity involves being able to say, I'm sorry, being able to admit when we were wrong, and seeking to make amends in order to fulfill what is right. And so my friends, my church, my community, my hope is that you see in your own life how you can best live these things out in order to be a person who is not a toxic person, but someone who fully loves God and loves others with everything they have. May you and may I see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, wherever life takes us. Amen.
Will you stand and watch while all the seeds of hate are sown? Will you stand with those who say, let His will be done? With one hand on the Bible and one hand on the gun. One hand on the Bible and one hand on the gun. Which way are you looking? Is it hard to see? Do you say what's wrong for them is not wrong for me? Lines have changed, we rearranged, and what have we become? The olive branches turn to spears, and the flowers turn to stone. Oh, the olive branches turn to spears, and the flowers turn to stone. Now you've turned your back on all the things that you used to preach. Now it's let them live in freedom, only if they live like me. You want the streets of righteousness, but you refuse to understand. You say you love the baby, but then you crucify the man. I don't understand. You say you love the baby, but then you crucify the man. You say you love the baby, but then you crucify the man.
Amen. Thank you so much to participating in worship with us. If you want to continue to support Paradox, you can give at paradoxgiving.com.